Udlakut. That's high, hello, at least before 12. Unasakut, after 12, in Inuktitut. I'm going to start with a story. This is a story told by Norman Halliday. And Norman Halliday wrote a book some of you can find, if you like. It came out a few years ago, called Inukshuit. For those of you who've seen them, have you seen them? You've probably seen them. They've become quite popular in the last 10 years, those rock cairns that people build, and they say, you know, those Eskimo rock cairns, right? Inuit rock cairns. So a single one is called an Inukshuk. Inuktitut language that is used in the Arctic actually is extremely logical grammatically. So the town I lived in for 12 years is called Iqaluit. That means place of many fish. But Iqaluk is place of one fish. So Inukshuk is one stone cairn, but if you have a lot of them, it's Inukshuit. So it has a nice, once you learn certain rules, the language follows in a certain way. So Norman Halliday wrote this book called Inukshuit, which is quite good. He's probably one of the best anthropologists documenting these structures. And one of his ideas about 10, 15 years ago was to start an art magazine in Canada focused on Inuit art. And again, if you're familiar with it, it's become quite a popular thing, Inuit printmaking. And in particular, they're on the back of our Canadian quarters. I don't have one with me right now, but on many of them, if you've ever seen them, some of them have an owl on the back. Now that stylized owl, which is a print from the Canadian North, was done by a woman who recently died, who's one of the best Inuit printmakers in the North. Her name's Kanoiwak Ashevak, and she had dozens of grandchildren and was kind of a pinnacle of the art movement there. So Norm, when he decided he was going to make an art magazine, he thought, I'll put one of her prints on the front of the art magazine, if she'll let me have one. So he phoned her up from Ottawa, up to Cape Dorset, Kingite in Inuktitut, where she was living. And he doesn't speak fluent Inuktitut, so he spoke through her daughter on the extension, translating for her. And the daughter translated from his English into Inuktitut. And he asked, I'm going to make this magazine, I'll bring a mock-up of it, would you be able to let me have one of your prints? And she said, yes. Okay. Well, I'll make a mock-up of it and get the advertisers and the funding lined up, and then I'll arrange an airfare, which is about $3,000, to fly 2.5 hours up to this part, about 2,500 kilometers up to Iqaluit, and then connect over to Kingite, and bring it to you in about 6 or 8 months. Okay, good. So that's set, and he goes about and does all that. He puts together the project, gets the funders, makes a mock-up, and he decides he'll leave blank at the top. He wants to call it art. So he asks her, actually, before he concludes the phone call, I want to call it art in Inuktitut. What do you think? Is that a good idea? Yes, that's a good idea. Okay, excellent. So he leaves that part blank. The Inuit language is written in syllabics, for those who've seen it, the Inuktitut language in the written form. So he flies north several months later, and he has a box and unfolds it. He has this thing, and he has an image of the ideal stencil art print of hers he'd like to use. And she says, that's fine, I'll let you use that print for free, and you can inaugurate this new magazine. And he then asks, and he says, well, I left blank at the top here what the word for art is, so I can put that in. Now, if you'll just tell me what the word for art is. And she says, in Inuktitut, through her daughter, there is no word for art. He says, what do you mean? That's the whole premise of this magazine. I've got to have a word for art to put on the top of the magazine. And I've got the advertisers. We're going to press. This magazine's going out. What's the word for art? Oh, there isn't a word for art. But you told me it was a good idea. It is a good idea. But there's no word for art. So he was flummoxed, and he didn't know where to proceed. He had this big project ready to go, and he didn't have a word to put on the top. And then he realized, wait a second, every time I phone you, your daughter, through translation, she's translating me, and I'm talking to you about art, and she's translating something. So there is something we're discussing here. What's the word that she's translating? And they confer for a minute, and then Kanoyoak says, well, it's not a word, it's a phrase. And he says, okay, so what's the phrase? And they confer for a moment. And then the daughter translates into English, that which takes something real and makes it more real than it was before. I lived in Nunavut for 12 years, and for most of my life I've been non-Indigenous person. Arguably, I still am. And most of the time up there was an experience in learning what it is to be non-Indigenous, and what lessons we might be able to learn from Indigenous peoples about how to re-indigenize ourselves. Because after living there for 12 years and still working with and for what is the equivalent of the Inuit tribal government for that area, if there are civilizations in the future, they're going to have to be Indigenous. We can't continue with a non-Indigenous civilization the way we've constructed it. It's just, it won't survive. The territory that I've been talking to you about is the top, if you can imagine a map of North America, and you just basically slice the top fifth off of it. That's, because I didn't bring a PowerPoint for this, the top fifth of Canada is the Nunavut territory. Everything above the tree line belongs to the Nunavut Inuit, and that's the group I've been working with and for many years. That territory has 26 communities. Many, like you were describing, Gian, are remote, fly-in only, no roads, accessible by dog team or skidoo, and plane. And 25 of the 26 are on water. So this is a marine culture, because although a lot of that water is frozen most of the time. Of that, there are 30,000 people there, about 26,000 Inuit, and 4,000 Kadlunat, that's us non-Indigenous people. Of the 26,000 Inuit, about 75% still speak the Inuit language as their first language. That's the healthiest Indigenous language in North America in terms of the usage. When I first arrived, one of the elders I met with asked me, where did you come from? More importantly, where is your mother and father? I said, in Toronto. And she said, how far? And I said, 2,500 kilometers. And she went, oh, she touched my arm. And she said, when will you see them next? I said, probably next year, maybe Christmas. She said, oh, touched my arm again. And these kinds of interactions were the first I'd ever had with a healthy culture, comparatively healthy culture, that viewed my culture as something kind of traumatizing and terribly full of suffering. And I couldn't quite understand why we endured the types of things we do. And I think it's this kind of compassionate outlook that we have to have of the non-Indigenous civilization that we've created. A friend of mine worked for National Geographic for many years, and he told me that the top-selling 2 issues they do every year is either polar issue. If they put a penguin on the cover or an Eskimo, they'll sell out. And having now spent 12 years living with Inuit, I no longer think Indigenous cultures are odd or we should fetishize them. What's extremely odd and aberrant is non-Indigenous culture. For 40,000 years, humans have lived in the Indigenous way. It seems like this last few hundred years is best understood as the advent of a non-Indigenous culture. One of the predominant forces that does this de-indigenizing of us, you've just heard Manish talk about extensively, is the education system. It seems like if you put people in a cement building, away from their families, in age-divided cohorts, under fluorescent lights, and feed them kind of hydroponically, learning, you're creating a soil-less culture, really, aren't you? It's like hydroponic learning. And these forms of education that uproot us from the land and from the place and from our bonds with each other and are automatically kind of de-indigenizing us. So it's no surprise that after the advent of the Idle No More movement in Canada in the last couple of years, the biggest single new budget item in the Canadian federal government, $1.1 billion announced in February of 2013, was for Indigenous education. That's not because the Harper government, as you may know, our equivalent of Reagan, is in love with Indigenous people. It's because he quite clearly sees that Indigenous people are loyal to the land. And if they're going to get the resources from under those people's feet, they're going to have to break that bond between the Indigenous people and the land. And the way to do that is schooling. And Manish has described you how that works. Now, I'm actually in the Faculty of Education. And the reason is I'd like to find out how we talk about recovering our social fabric and our responsibilities to each other. And one of the ways it's been most helpful for me to understand de-indigenization, and when I've been working in the Inuit organizations, and I should say one of the first resources we used when I worked in an Inuit organization in the social policy division was Helena's video for Ancient Futures. And even though this is a nomadic hunting culture, watching a video in English about an agrarian Himalayan culture, they totally got what was going on. The video was incredibly helpful for explaining the connections between culture and land. As the founder of the Inuit independence movement, John Amalgoalek, says, when he was asked on Canadian television in 1975 how much money Inuit were going to ask for in their land claim, he looked quizzically and he said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "How much money do you want?" He said, "I don't understand that question." "Well, don't you want money for the land?" He says, "The land is something inside you. Don't you understand that?" And the television interviewer didn't understand it. So how do we help ourselves recover that understanding of land as something inside us and our responsibilities to each other? I think regrowing the social fabric amongst ourselves doing that is we can be helped in observing currently surviving Indigenous cultures. What are some of the things that they do that have made them resilient? And how could we possibly become what in Canada is used as an insult? And I would argue we haven't even lived up to this insult yet, which is in Canada, my people, Kadlunat, are referred to as settlers. Well, the average Canadian family, I'm not sure about the US, maybe you stay put a lot more, but the average Canadian family moves every 6 years. So we're hardly settlers yet. We haven't even earned that insult. At some point or other, we're going to have to actually commit to landscapes and peoples and start looking after them and each other in ways that don't completely rely on service providers to do it for us. And by that, I'm referring now to an old paper by a disciple or friend of Ivan Illich's, a guy named Nils Christie, a Norwegian philosopher, criminologist, who wrote a paper in 1977 called Conflict as Property. And he published it in the British Journal of Criminology. And what he said was, conflict should be treated like gold or oil. Something extremely important to what we are as people. How we resolve conflict, how we find ways to disagree in a healthy way with each other, how we move forward. This is vital, instead of just relying on or allowing our conflict to be expropriated out of our society and taken by justice institutions, policemen, judges, lawyers, and then when your neighbor turns up the stereo, you dial 911. Why is it that we're so averse to this? How do we relearn how to responsibly and in a healthy way relate to each other? And we can't wait for the neighbor to turn up the stereo before we have some social bonds there. We should be trying to create some of this social fabric before that happens, ideally, right? Rebecca Solnit, as you might know, wrote a book in 2006 called A Paradise Built in Hell. In it, she studied Hurricane Katrina and other disasters, and she studied societies that were more resilient, communities that bounced back, and ones that weren't and that didn't. And the trait of all the communities that bounced back, and this has been studied at disaster research institutes that she cites in the United States, is that they had some kind of social fabric going into those crises beforehand. And that when the crises arise, as she says, the first responders are not firemen and ambulance attendants. The first responders are your neighbors. So how do we develop more of that resilience amongst ourselves? I think recovering mentorships, relations with elders, what I would argue community feasts. Probably the most important aspect of my learning in Nunavut was going to community feasts. And I'm going to end by talking about that because it gives you an idea of the inventiveness. Lewis Mumford once said that we betray ourselves by clinging to carapace archaeology, that we only look at the shells of things society leave behind. You know, the hard shells, they leave behind an aqueduct or a pyramid. But what if a society invents the best way of childcare? The soft insides never stay behind when the culture disappears. So here's one of those soft insides, because in Inuit society, they haven't left behind a lot. But when you live with them, there's all sorts of insights into how would you tolerate living in a place for 6 months when you're crammed in a kagik, which is a large communal igloo, where you're spending a lot of time in it. Obviously, you're going to get on each other's nerves. We're not saints. Inuit aren't saints. So here's one of the ways. I'll just quick explanation. And this happens, there are tons of ways they use community games at community feasts for kind of dissolving tensions and lessening hierarchies. So when I arrived, what I was shocked to find was the richest person in the room, who might be the head of the land claim organization or one of the white guys running a mine or something. Actually, there were very few white people at community feasts when I first started going to them. But there would be 200 or 300 people. There'd be raw seal, muktuk, narwhal around to be eaten. But then people would clear a space in the middle. This is one of maybe 200 types of Inuit games that go on through the winter. And you'd be lined up, maybe 6 or 8 people, and you get a piece of fish line, and then you tie it to your belt loop, and there'd be a hook on the bottom. And then you'd be asked to squat, and everybody goes through this. So like the 3-year-old kid, the wealthiest guy in the town, the poorest guy, the slightly mentally unhinged person, as long as they're okay, they're in the lineup, and you race against them. The race is, you've got to pick up an empty Coke can with that fish hook, which is, your fish line is only about 2 feet long, or actually 18 inches long, and carry it to the finish line. And everybody around the edge laughs their heads off at you while you do it, because this is what you look like. That's one of the soft insides of a culture. Imagine 200 other games like that for helping resolve, creating laughter and community instead of, and dealing with conflict, or having ways for diffusing some of the conflict in a population that has to spend periods of time and concentrate it together. These are the kinds of things that cultural diversity, the kinds of reasons cultural diversity needs to be so protected, guarded, and looked out for. Also, the kind of linguistic importance that the Inuit language holds, with all sorts of insights, as Konoyawak's one about the meaning of the word art have for us. So I can maybe speak more about these things in Q&A if there's interest, but I think it's incumbent on us as non-Indigenous people to resist the tide of de-indigenization and figure out, as Gary Snyder said when he was asked, how do we save the environment? And he answered with 2 words: stay put.
So what I'd like to do is zoom out a bit and talk about the framework in which some of these new structures are going to be emerging. We have had a framework over the period of our lifetime and decades before of continual economic growth. And so I think it's typical that most people assume that this is something that goes way back in history, it's normal, it's something that we all want and expect, and it can continue more or less forever. That's simply not supported by the facts. Economic growth, in fact, is something that's pretty recent in human history. And it happened as a result of some unique circumstances. First of all, when we're talking about economic growth, we're really talking about the growth of economies starting out in the Western world, the European economies. And so the European expansion throughout the rest of the world produced a lot of wealth for European economies, and then that was built upon and expanded dramatically by the fossil fuel revolution more recently. Now, just in the last few decades, growth is starting to stall out. Now, economists recognize this, but generally believe that it's due to some problems inherent within the system that we can work out so we can get back to normal. But we have to remember that normal, in fact, is a condition of no growth. It's the growth bubble that's the remarkable thing that requires explanation. The idea that there are inherent limits to growth is certainly not an original or new one. This was discussed as far back as 1972 when a team of scientists at MIT used a computer to look at the likely interactions between population expansion, resource depletion, and environmental degradation. And the most likely scenario, the standard run scenario, showed a peaking and decline in world industrial output sometime in the first half of this century, the 21st century. So what we're actually seeing may in fact be simply the outworking of some more or less inevitable trends. And I'm going to talk about two of them, energy and climate. Now, energy is important to understand because it's really the basis of everything. The economy doesn't work on money, it works on energy. Without energy, nothing happens. We human beings have used energy forever, originally in the forms of food and firewood and muscle power, but more recently in the form of fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are unique in all of human history. Nature produced them over the course of millions of years, concentrated sunlight. If you've ever had the experience of running out of gas in your car and pushing your car off to the side of the road, you have some kind of intuitive recognition of just how powerful fossil fuels are. Imagine pushing your car, say, 20 or 30 miles. Well, we get that done for us with a single gallon of gasoline, for which we're paying $3. What is pushing your car 20 or 30 miles? How much work is that? Maybe 6 or 8 weeks of hard labor, for which, again, we're paying $2 or $3. That's incredibly cheap energy. We discovered buried treasure, and we've been spending it as fast as we can ever since. And that's the real basis of most of the economic growth that we've seen. Now, fossil fuels are depleting non-renewable resources that we've extracted using the low-hanging fruit principle. So it's not as though we're about to run out of coal, natural gas, or oil, but we've got the best of them. And as time goes on, we have to expend more and more effort, more and more money, and more energy to get the next increment of fossil fuels out of the ground. That means we're bumping up against the law of diminishing returns. And that is part of what is causing growth to slow down. This is just what's happening in the oil industry. The same thing will be happening with natural gas and coal in slightly delayed fashion, but we're not talking about decades and decades from now. We're talking about really the next few years. This is an ongoing, real-time experience that we're having here of increasing costs and diminishing returns. Now, oil is hard to substitute. There are different ways of substituting for oil. We can drive electric cars, for example, but we're not going to drive electric or we're not going to fly electric airliners because the batteries would be too heavy. Similarly, electric 18-wheel trucks, bulldozers, and so on, very unlikely. So we're really looking at a very different kind of future as we transition away from fossil fuels. Now, the most likely substitute energy sources for fossil fuels will be renewable sources like solar and wind. Nuclear globally is not growing, it's going away, and for very good reasons. And if you start looking around at other potential energy sources, there's really not that much there. Most of the growth that's occurring now is in renewables. And we want and we need more renewable sources of energy. However, wind and solar are inherently intermittent sources of energy. The wind isn't always blowing, sun isn't always shining. There are ways of making up for that with energy storage, by creating massive redundancy of generation capacity. But these things cost money and energy. Another difficulty that we have to overcome in this next energy transition is the fact that the last energy transition to fossil fuels was an additive one. We just kept adding new sources of energy to what we already had. We're still using firewood, right? Whereas we're talking about changing out almost all of our current energy sources for different ones. Also, we created our massive current infrastructure for using energy on the basis of expectations based around the qualities and characteristics and quantities of energy that we were getting from fossil fuels. So this is going to be a lot of work, and a lot of things can go wrong. Generally speaking, our energy future is going to be less mobile, more localized, and we're likely to have a lot less energy to play with. And that energy will have different characteristics. Rather than being, 24/7 available on demand, it will be, we will need to organize our use of energy around when and how energy is available to be used. We're going to have to understand the difference between and relationship between operational energy, which is the gasoline you put in the car tank, and embodied or embedded energy, the energy it took to build the car, to build the road that the car is driving on, and all the gas stations and all the other systems that make it possible for you to drive a car. Now, that's one example, but think about how this plays out in the built structures and infrastructures of our society, and in the products that we use, the food that we consume, how much of that is embodied, how much energy is embodied in the food that we use, in terms of food miles, in terms of packaging, and so on. So here are some of the structural considerations that we're going to be dealing with as we move into the new energy era with regard to food. With regard to water. With regard to resource extraction. With regard to construction of buildings. With regard to manufacturing. And transportation. We're going to have to start thinking about modes of transportation. Now, energy is one of the two big areas that I want to touch on that have to do with the end of of economic growth as we've known it. The other is climate change. We know that climate change is a world-altering, planet-altering impact of our current energy use, fossil fuels, energy sources, a set of energy sources. If climate change continues as on the course it's currently set on, the result will be the end of economic growth as we've known it, and in fact the end of probably civilization as we've known it. But if we choose to do something about climate change, what would that mean? That would mean rapidly and dramatically getting off of fossil fuels. Well, in order to make enough of a difference, we would have to do that so fast as to curtail growth also. So any way you look at it, the same future awaits us. We've been told that growth is good for us, it's inevitable, it's necessary, jobs, returns on investments, tax revenues for governments, and so on. But the fact is we live on a finite planet. And the economy, as we've built it, is in fact an engine. It's a thermodynamic engine for taking labor and nature and churning it up and turning it into pollution. So the post-growth economy is inevitable. It's going to look very, very different from what we are used to now, necessarily so. And it's going to be a good thing. We hear about the sharing economy and the burgeoning of the sharing economy and the localization movement. These are just the early stages of transition and transformation to the post-growth economy. I want to leave you with the thought that the post-growth economy is not an option, it's inevitable. The creative challenge of our time is to anticipate it, to imagine it, and to pre-adapt so that others, as time goes on, will have an easier time doing so themselves. And I wish you all good cheer in doing so. Thank you.
You are amazing, and I love you all. And I love the work that you're doing. I've been talking with people for the last few days and being reinvigorated and inspired by all the wonderful things you're doing, both here in Portland, in Seattle, across the country, and from overseas. And all the things you're doing, from community gardens to prison visitation programs to DIY upcycling. All of these things are excitingly contributing to a new economics that exists beyond capitalism. It's a not-for-profit economy that's emerging. And to begin with, I'd like you to pause for 15 seconds and see what are the images or the words that come up for you when I say the words not-for-profit or non-profit. Take 15 seconds to feel what those words are. So could I grab from the audience a few of the words that came up in relation to non-profit or not-for-profit? Sorry? Difficult. Struggling. Passion. Unselfish. Values-based mission. Relationships. Corporate funded. Resilient. Okay, just one more. Greater good. Foundations. Thank you so much. This is great because I grew up in the 1980s, and all the words you've just mentioned were the words that I associated with not-for-profit organizations. They were charity-dependent organizations. They were based largely on volunteer efforts and support. And the exciting thing is that over the last 20 and 30 years, what we understand as not-for-profit has totally changed. In the latest study that was done across 27 different nations, including the US, Canada, UK, and Australia, 43% of not-for-profit organisations' revenue is now self-generated. Why has this happened? Well, of course, the boom and bust cycle built into capitalism meant that not-for-profit managers found that when there was a bust, all of their funding dropped out. So they started to look to resilient measures to respond to that. And they built business models in under their organisations. And here I'm talking not just about 501c3 non-profit organisations. I'm talking about community land trusts, consumer cooperatives, co-housing, all sorts of things that exist in a model that is not for profit in the sense that any profit that is made in the business activity associated with the entity is put back in to the organisation, is refunneled in a generative process rather than the extractive process that sits underneath the for-profit capitalistic system. Now, many people have put forward some alternatives for what we need to do in relation to the two main crises that we face. Massive financial inequity, where 75 people own and control more than half of the world's wealth, and the climate crises that we're familiar with. And the standard responses go like this. We open up the market and make it a more free market, and we know what historically that does for inequity. It defies physics in the way that the money just trickles upwards. And at the other end of the spectrum, when we have state-centred or planned approaches or heavy market regulation, there are some important deficits that exist within that model because, as we've seen in the past in the Cold War, when power is centralised, it generally doesn't work very well for any individual within the wider community. And it actually has a stifling effect when you look at innovation, both in terms of social and technological, when we are heavy-handed in this space. So these two approaches, both of them at different ends of the spectrum, still engage with a notion that we can have for-profit business, that we can privatise wealth through our business systems. The fundamental problem with the privatisation of wealth, and with people not saying, here's an economics of enough where I can cap my income based on my wage, is that it has a centralising tendency. Any for-profit system will always see, over time, a rising wealth inequality. And that's essentially a message that sits underneath Thomas Piketty's latest work as much as anything. The message I'm here to share with you in these last few minutes is that a very exciting alternative has been emerging, where we actually, if you look at business competitiveness over time, and you compare, for example, a joint stock corporation that is not interested in environmental issues compared to one that is, versus a state-owned enterprise, versus a worker cooperative, a consumer cooperative, a not-for-profit enterprise. If you look at the spectrum of business entities, legal models of the firm, what the data is showing is that not-for-profit organisations are increasingly outcompeting the equivalent for-profit organisations, and worker co-ops are outcompeting the ones further to the right on that spectrum as well. Green businesses that are corporations are outcompeting the non-green ones. In other words, there is an arc of the economic universe that actually bends towards equality. We actually are seeing a shift in competitiveness where capitalism brings itself to its own end by allowing a competitive marketplace in which not-for-profit business actually outcompetes for-profit business. Now, I'd love to talk with people about this, about the work we've done over the last 5 years that will be coming out in our book, How on Earth, Flourishing in a Not-for-Profit World by 2050, and to go into all the details about taxation, inflation, debt, fractional reserve banking, all the things that we looked at, that every turn we made, we realised that the more businesses that are not-for-profit, such as every credit union in the US, for example, which is a not-for-profit financial institution, the more it shifts in that direction, the more we actually start to see a world that goes beyond capitalism. And it actually works. We've modelled it in terms of how it works, in terms of redistribution. It functions, it's effective. We engage with all of the challenges that exist in the non-profit model and talk about things like the NFL not-for-profit organisation CEO salary of $39 million. And we engage with those things, and there's a way that actually works out beyond that. So to end, I'd like to just share a little story that you may be familiar with about Joseph Heller, author of Catch-22. He was at a party out off the east coast of the US, and it was for an investment banker of his putting on a big party. And his friend Kurt came up to him and said, "Joseph, you must be really depressed here at this event because this guy earns more in a day than you'll earn in the whole course of your book sales throughout your lifetime. And Joseph said to him, "Doesn't bother me." And Kurt said, "Why is that?" And Joseph said, "Because I've got something that he'll never have. Enough."
Thank you. Thank you very much. We love Portland, and as I said, we hope to have an ongoing relationship with you guys. So, I first of all want to talk a little bit about the nature of the conference and then come to real wealth and explain that for many people it might seem very odd to have this combination. On the one hand, paleo diet, on the other hand, the magic vision of Charles, and on the other hand, measurements of, new measurements for GPI instead of GDP. A very broad mix we have here. I actually think that developing a certain axis for thinking of this can be helpful. I know that my colleague Charles will probably think of this as too Western and intellectualized, but I think that a certain axis to see the framing of all of this can be helpful. So our axis comes from having worked simultaneously in the least industrialized, urbanized parts of the world, and on the other side of the world, in your country, the most industrialized, the most urbanized, the most corporatized country in the world. Now, working on those extreme polar opposites in the world led us to come up with this bigger picture that we stand by and that we think is very useful. Now, as it turns out, that big picture is also about looking at where we are right now and where we might want to end up, or where we want to be. And as I try to say in my book, Ancient Futures, I see an intuitive turning, very similar to what Charles is talking about. There's an intuitive turning towards the magic, the beauty, the mystery, and the life of the natural world, turning towards nature. There is a huge shift going on where we are often in unconscious ways turning back to what ancient nature-based embedded cultures knew all along. That is, we are the natural world. Our health, the health of Mother Gaia are one. Our polarizing intellect, from our left brain, which only allowed us to see from here up, and where we started joining into this fragmented way of looking at the world, that we are separate from nature, that everything else can be understood by slicing it into neat slices, creating this reductionist, fragmented view through which we view the world. We're beginning to turn away from that in 1,000,001 ways. I mean, there are so many practices, of course, meditation being the most fundamental, but there are even now technologies that are probably quite valid in helping us to balance our brain back to a better equilibrium between that left brain, which we do need every time we take an action. We are using a type of analysis or reductionism, but every time we calm down and slow down and to contemplate the whole, it's the other side of the brain. So there is this ancient futures turning going on that we often don't see. But we believe, passionately believe, that, as I was saying in the opening evening, that we actually need to engage in a bit of both. In other words, we need what we often call both resistance and renewal. On the opening evening, I said something about practicing creative schizophrenia. And someone came up to me and said, don't use that word. I suffer from schizophrenia. Don't use that word. So I take that back. Another way to talk about it is that we need to engage in both resistance and renewal. The resistance part has to do with understanding that out of this trajectory where we started fragmenting our worldview and where we went along with the belief that we are separate from nature, that trajectory has continued in an economic system. It is a techno-economic system of big money linked to technology, taking us further and further away from the natural world, carrying us without us seeing the process. So so one of the things that we need to do in terms of resistance is to understand what is that trajectory, how is that working? And as I think I said on the opening evening, it's crucial and really empowering to understand that the trade treaties, bilateral, multilateral, under WTO, outside the WTO, this has been a thread, a vehicle whereby our political leaders have gone along with deregulating global banks and corporations. Deregulating the multinationals has been about giving them freedom. And that freedom, as I said the other night, is about them being allowed to sue our government if our government protects the environment or our health or our well-being, our jobs. So please, please do pay attention to that. It will mean a bit of your intellectual left brain engaging. Don't have to become an economist. Do not have to read those trade treaties, which, by the way, only teams of lawyers can decipher. They are made by teams of lawyers, for teams of lawyers, who work for the corporations, and those same lawyers can represent a corporation in the morning, and in the afternoon they can stand as judges in these tribunals where the corporations sue government. It's utterly mad. We would be laughing this out of court, out of our world, out of our society, if we just knew about it. So there is this invisible thing going on in a trajectory that takes us further away from what we long for, which is that deeper connection. So do commit to at least devoting a little bit of your time to that resistance, while giving at least an equally big chunk of your time to the renewal. And what does the renewal look like? Well, a while back, I made a bit of a list of the wealth that this ancient Ladakhi culture had that I knew so intimately, and also Bhutan, where I worked over a 5-year period. In these cultures and others that I came to know, there was this incredible real wealth. And these are just some of the factors that wealth consisted of. Daily exercise and movement. But we're talking hours. We're not talking about running in frantically to a gym, to spend half an hour. We're talking about most of the day being able to move with your body. And I hope you know the doctors who are now urging us to get up from our computer every 15 minutes just to move about. One of the best things we can do for longevity and health. They had fresh, healthy, local food as a given. They had plenty of time, and as we've been hearing, the importance of time, plenty of time. Leisure time and time to do everything at a human pace. We are running after our technologies. We need another whole conference just to look at how we're ending up trying to keep up with the speed of our technologies, rather than allowing our technologies to really serve us. This is why we're running so fast. Everyone engaged in song, music making, and dance. Another incredible gift. It's one of the most wonderful things we can do together to celebrate life, to feel our own empowerment. Singing is like an inner yoga, just the breathing. And as we sing one tone together, it's one of the closest ways of coming to that sense of spiritual connectedness. meaningful work, meaning that people had the right and the ability to see the product of their labors, to actually see that they had done something, accomplished something. There was no such thing as unemployment. And remember, there are still many cultures living in what we call the poorest of the poor parts of the world that have this wealth. No unemployment. You felt empowered because along with that economy where you could see the products of your labor and where you were actually engaged in doing something productive, you were living at a scale where you could see that your voice, your productivity actually translated into power over your own self-determination. We need localization for all these reasons, but that's one of the key reasons. We need to decentralize so that we have that greater power and determination over our lives. We're not going to go back to decentralizing to the extent of these traditional cultures, but there are certain key elements like these that I believe we must regain. Maybe one of the most important gifts was that in a more human-scale community fabric, as young people grew up, they had the great privilege of being loved for who they are, being seen close to hand, knowing that the love and the support they were getting came from people who knew them as they were, not because they were wearing the Nike running shoes or looked the right way as the media was determining. Part of that was, of course, this community web where you had a sense of interdependence. Vicky has already spoken beautifully about it. So the interdependence where you know you can count on your neighbor and your neighbor knows they can count on you, in that situation you have a natural gift culture. There's so much that gets exchanged without needing money to intervene. However, from where we are today, it's clear that we do need money to make the transition, and ultimately we'll probably want to end up with a certain degree of monetarization, but a massive step towards decommercialization. The community fabric, and I talked about that earlier, central to that was the intergenerational fabric where old and young were together day and night. An incredible wealth for both the young and the old. Access to wild nature. Being able to peek into the miraculous wealth of wild nature and having that usually as a daily experience. And that in turn was completely inextricably tied to beauty. To beauty, as Sandra was talking about yesterday, to the beauty of the natural world. And this in turn was also part of a cultural way of being where your spiritual connections to the living world and to other human beings, your spiritual connections were an experience of every day linked to traditions of quieting the mind, of quite consciously encouraging a spirituality which, as I experienced it in these cultures, was more along the lines of what Eckhart Tolle says in The Power of Now. In other words, it took me many years to realize that what I was witnessing was people who were moving in and out of that expansive, quiet mind and space, and then saying, "How are you today? Did you go to the village today?" And then again, "Om Mani Padme Hum," as they spun their prayer wheel, and then back again to continue the conversation. So literally mid-sentence, I came to realize that people moved in and out of that quiet space that Catherine described earlier today. So this is why, this is a little bit of an explanation, why are we covering such a broad church, but how it's all connected, because everything in life is connected. Thank you. in every corner of the world, we are being pressured by a monoculture, a global consumer monoculture. It is being pushed by our governments who have a blind idea of growth and development.
The promise of development and progress is starting to crack. The issues facing us are connected to a common global economic system. All of our people are being squeezed every day by that. And all of our imaginations are being colonized by that system.
What we need is not scaling up of those solutions, but scaling out of those solutions, replication in millions of these variety of solutions, innovative solutions that are emerging. It's quite possible.
What we need to do is to actually create platforms in which these sorts of initiatives are able to get together, are able to synergize, are able to actually build those larger narratives, are able to begin to change the public discourse.
We're trying to create an alliance, an international alliance for localization, because we need a united no, one giant no to a continuation of that system. And at the same time, we need to see ourselves as actually part of an enormous movement involving hundreds of millions of people that are saying many yeses to diverse ecosystems, diverse cultures, diverse identities. This is about reclaiming our right to be who we are in our different ways of being. It's about reclaiming the diversity that is life.